For centuries, Africa supplied the labor that helped build empires and iconic structures. Millions of Africans were taken through the transatlantic slave trade. Millions more were trafficked through the Indian Ocean and Arab slave trade routes. Then came colonialism, land theft, forced labor, and the extraction of wealth that helped shape the modern global economy. Now, centuries later, an old question is returning with new urgency. Should those who benefited from slavery and colonialism pay reparations? And for East Africa specifically, is the region bold enough to demand accountability from both its European colonizers and the Arab slave traders? That debate took center stage in Ghana on June 18th and the 19th of 2026. African and Caribbean nations adopted a joint 19-point reparations plan calling for formal apologies from countries that profited from slavery, debt cancellation for affected nations, financial compensation, the return of stolen cultural artifacts, climate justice financing, and reforms to global financial institutions. The plan comes just months after a landmark United Nations resolution in March recognized the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity in human history. The UN resolution has added fresh momentum to the global reparations movement, giving political weight to long-standing demands for accountability and redress. The proposal is now expected to be presented before the United Nations General Assembly. This makes it one of the most coordinated international pushes for reparatory justice in recent history, because slavery was more than a historical injustice. It was a global economic system that transferred wealth out of Africa into the hands of colonial powers, creating inequalities that still exist today. But when it comes to East Africa, the silence is loud. Kenya offers perhaps the strongest example of confrontation. In 2009, Mau Mau veterans sued the British government for torture and abuse committed during the colonial rule. 5 elderly Kenyans who were detained and tortured by British colonial masters during the 1950s Mau Mau uprising took lead. However, the victims that had nothing to do with the rebellion but were subjected to detention without trial, torture, and other inhuman treatments. While the British government insisted that the claims were time-barred, the court ruled that the case was valid. The outcome was historic. 5,000 more victims came up. The court directed Britain to pay nearly £19.9 million in compensation to the survivors, fund a memorial in Nairobi, and issue a formal apology. For many Africans, it showed that colonial powers could be held accountable. Yet even in Kenya, the conversation has rarely expanded into broader demands for compensation over colonial land theft or slavery. Tanzania has taken a different route. Its focus has largely been on Germany's colonial legacy. After years of pressure over atrocities committed during the Maji Maji Rebellion, Germany's President Frank-Walter traveled to Songea and publicly asked for forgiveness. Tanzania has also pushed for the return of thousands of stolen artifacts and ancestral remains taken to Europe during colonial rule. Rather than pursuing major financial settlements, Tanzania has focused on recognition, apologies, and the return of cultural heritage. Then there is Uganda. Uganda's position is perhaps the most complicated. For years, President Yoweri Museveni has been one of Africa's most vocal leaders on the damage caused by slavery, colonialism, and foreign exploitation. At international forums, including the United Nations, he has described Africa's experience with foreign powers as a 500-year human hemorrhage that drained the continent of its people and wealth. He has repeatedly argued that slavery, colonial plunder, and genocide slowed Africa's development and left scars that remain visible today. Yet despite this rhetoric, Uganda has never turned those arguments into a formal reparations campaign. Unlike Kenya, which challenged Britain in court, or Tanzania, which has pushed Germany to apologize for its past, Uganda has largely stopped at speaking out. Museveni has instead leaned toward forgiveness over compensation, a position inherited from many of Africa's post-independent leaders. In one speech, he described Africans as forgiving people, arguing that while the crimes of slavery and colonialism should never be forgotten, Africa's focus should be economic transformation rather than the repayment for historical wrongs. The result is a curious contradiction. Uganda has been willing to quantify the damage, identify the perpetrators, and condemn the injustice. But it has stopped short of demanding legal accountability, financial compensation, or formal reparations. Although the transatlantic trade was centered on the Atlantic coast, European demand for enslaved labor contributed to a broader African slave economy. Some captives from East African countries were eventually transported across the Atlantic, though in relatively small numbers. But Europe was not the only player. For centuries, the Arab slave trade moved millions of Africans through East African ports such as Zanzibar and Bagamoyo to markets across the Middle East and Asia. So why are there far fewer calls for accountability from Arab and Asian countries? Part of the answer lies in present-day realities. Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania have not pursued compensation or legal claims against countries linked to the Indian Ocean slave trade. Instead, they have focused on education, memorial archives, and preserving historical sites. The past is remembered, but governments have largely avoided international confrontation. The reason is simple. Today, East Africa relies heavily on Gulf investment, labor migration opportunities, trade partnerships, and infrastructure financing. For many governments, reopening historical wounds could complicate relationships they see as economically important. In other words, history collides with geopolitics. And that raises a difficult question. Can a country truly seek justice for historical wrongs when doing so may threaten present-day interests? Ghana and several Caribbean nations appear willing to test that question on the global stage. East Africa, however, has chosen a more cautious route. Kenya has shown it can challenge a former colonial power in court. Tanzania has secured apologies and fought for the return of stolen heritage. Uganda has condemned historical exploitation while preaching forgiveness and development. But none has fully embraced a reparations campaign against either European colonial powers or Arab slave trading states. So what does justice actually look like? Is it compensation, an apology, the return of stolen heritage, or economic self-determination? For now, East Africa appears caught between two competing realities: the need to confront history and the need to navigate the present. As the global reparations movement gains momentum, the region may soon have to decide whether remembering the past is enough or whether it is finally time to demand something more.